Hello and welcome. In this video, we'll be talking about trauma and the practical implications for tribal justice system practitioners. Why is trauma important for tribal justice practitioners to think about and to consider in their work?
I can speak to that some. I think that it's relevant in my daily work, in the way that I interact with my clients, in the way that I tell my clients' stories to the court. I have to be always mindful of my clients' traumatic experiences. And we know that, the last time that we got statistics on the prevalence of trauma among our clients, half of them identified to have symptoms of PTSD, but 87% were experiencing co-occurring and substance use disorders. So we know that it might be underreported. Maybe people aren't self-identifying, but they're certainly experiencing those effects from traumatic experiences, I believe.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing your perspective as a defense attorney. I'm interested in hearing from Jerry as a tribal prosecutor. Why do you think trauma is important for prosecutors to think about in their work?
I think that it is inherent in the work that we do in recognizing the experiences that, first of all, that the victim has gone through, because as a prosecutor, I speak on behalf of victims. But I also recognize the culture, the climate, and the environment that not only the victim most times, but the suspect has also experienced. Not only that, if we have a jury trial, I'm also very cognizant of what the jurors, who majority of them are going to be Native people from the community. So everyone recognizes the experience, but doesn't always recognize it as trauma, and recognize all the various symptoms and our reaction to it as a reaction to trauma. And the other unfortunate condition I see in our Native communities is that sometimes these trauma responses are so prevalent and we're worried about survival that we accept it as it's just the way it is. The high rate of sexual assault, the high rate of domestic violence, the high rate of diabetes and other medical conditions as a result of the stress that comes about from the constant barrage of trauma. So keeping that in mind, and not only with speaking on behalf of the victim, but also in keeping in mind, for example, a sentencing recommendation. For Native communities, our traditional ways in tribal court, our traditional ways do not include jail or a fine. And that's often what we find that we're relegated to. So with trauma in mind, I think that what I like to do is try to do an assessment so we can find what are those trauma issues so that we can make that, or some kind of counseling, other ways of addressing the underlying problems, part of the sentencing recommendation. So it's not just punitive, but it's also tribal courts are concerned about healing. And that healing is an essential part of who we are as tribal people, as well as healing that one person, healing the victim, the family, and the community as a whole.
I just want to comment on how appreciative I am of Jerry's perspective on restorative justice, really, and a prosecutor's perspective. I appreciate that so much. What we see in our practice is a cumulative effect on families. So when there is a crime that occurs against a person, the family's affected, the family of the victim is affected, the family of the perpetrator is affected, the community, in a sense, is affected by that. And I know that when we've gone to our culture committees to get guidance on how to approach our re-entering clients that are coming back from jail and prison, they talk about the loss in their families when a family member goes away to prison, and the loss that they experience when the family member is not allowed to come back to the tribal community because of possibly probation and parole restrictions. And then the adjustment that they have to make when the person does come back and has to make amends. So thank you for starting out with that holistic viewpoint on how we approach crime. Everyone has been a victim at some time or another, the people I'm representing or the people that we're assisting in the community. And I need to be mindful of needs and gentle in my approach. And even in an adversarial system, I think that that can work. When I'm working in a tribal community and working with families, not only are the people that I represent who are accused of crimes victimized in prior incidents, but they also are within families where there's been trauma. And one of the things I was thinking about as I was preparing for today was about how my clients have experienced trauma at their own hands for things that they have, terrible things that they have done in the community, and probably gone off to prison and come back to the community and then are dealing with that terrible thing that they did. That really is traumatizing themselves. And we are having to deal with a lot of fallout from that, helping people deal with coming to terms with that and coming to, often those are people that are going to abuse substances when they get out because they just can't deal with it when they come back to the community, and how to use culture to help people reintegrate into the community after coming back, after doing something terrible, and how they can live with that. So I think that's another aspect of defendants and trauma that I wanted to acknowledge.
I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about some of the relationships between trauma and criminal behavior, which can look a lot of different ways. There can be a lot of different relationships there, if anyone wants to speak to that. We've already talked about substance use a bit, but other relationships you've seen.
I can speak a little bit more to that. A lot of what we are working with in the Tribal Defender's Office, especially in our reentry program, are our clients that are unable to follow sentencing conditions. So it's after there's been a conviction and there are conditions imposed by the court, whether it be the tribal court or state court, and people are unable to follow conditions. One theory we have is that sometimes those conditions just aren't rehabilitative for the individual, maybe not the thing that they need to do to be more successful and to not commit more crimes. But what we see more of than really recidivating in crimes is just the inability to follow conditions. I think avoidance has a lot to do with that, and Megan talked about that as a symptom of trauma. People just tend to avoid. And then if they use substances to deal with the trauma or to deal with just facing their own responsibilities, then that's going to spiral people so they just can't be successful. And then generally dealing with mental health issues. Also, we have people coming out of jail and prisons who don't have a place to live because they've been evicted, or housing authorities won't take them in because they have a criminal history or a history of substance use. That further drives people into the criminal justice system. And one of the things we've done on the Flathead Reservation is we started a pilot project of permanent supportive housing. The tribal defenders are the lead services provider for that program. And we are learning about trauma-informed care and permanent supportive housing. And one of the things our technical advisor talked to us about was the physical environment, especially after people have been incarcerated, which is traumatizing. And, what smells can trigger trauma reaction, colors, where doors are placed, things like that, where people can feel safe. And I'm sure that applies to victims of crime as well. So these are ways we're trying to look at the big picture in order to keep people safe and keep communities safe.
I'd like to add, in the context of human trafficking, when officers often look at the issue of prostitution. So you find someone is selling sex, a prostitute on the street, and they can pick them up. That's easy. But situation in cases like that, as in many of our other criminal cases, if you think of it like peeling back the layers of an onion, it gets ugly, but there's more to it. So you may have, and I really despise the language that we use to recognize what's going on in a human trafficking setting, but you've got a pimp and you've got a bottom and you've got other prostitutes. And if you have the bottom, that at one point in time, that was the victim, the one who was pulled in, the one who was enticed to sell sex. And then the pimp is forcing them to go out and sell sex, but she also has to, or he has to recruit others. And so they have to pull in other kids or other people who are part of this. So at one point in time, they were the victim, but then they have, for survival mechanisms, so for survival purposes, they become part of it. And then they are recruiting others. And so looking at it from a criminal aspect of what is the trauma and at what point in time does the victim become the perpetrator? And how do we peel back those layers of that onion, as uncomfortable or as difficult as it may be, to find out what was the beginnings of all of this? Because people don't grow up normally. People don't necessarily grow up to say, I think I want to be a bottom. I think that's going to be, a lot of fun to go recruit kids off the street and have them sell themselves for sex. So what was happening? How did they get involved? And it's more work. It is more investigative work. But in trying to get to the bottom of it, working through those layers of trauma to find out what is going on. And I use it in the context of human trafficking, because that one tends to be relatively easy for illustrative purposes. But that happens with a lot of our cases as well. The musical Les Miserables, he stole a loaf of bread to be able to help his family. So if you're looking at a breaking and entering, what's going on? I mean, there is the act itself. Maybe they're stealing to sell to get drugs, but sometimes there are different things going on. Again, I think it's important to peel back those layers, to peel back through the trauma and find out what is going on. What was the fundamental purpose of this? To be able to come around and be able to understand what's going on and make comprehensive actions within the justice system to be able to heal and to help.
I just building on what Jerry was speaking about, it makes me think about a series of interviews we did. We were assisting the University of Montana was doing a study at the women's prison in Montana to address the disproportionate number of Native women that are incarcerated. And it was an interview just to identify what led people there and also to identify resilience. And I think every single woman that I interviewed talked about childhood trauma, talked about childhood neglect, and really from a young age began really some pretty strong coping mechanisms, resilience possibly. However, it was criminal behavior. I mean, a lot of them were maybe selling drugs at a young age just to help the family make ends meet because parents were neglectful, maybe had substance use disorders, mental health issues. It was interesting to see how people coped from early on, what led them to being incarcerated, but they also had really strong plans for resilience on their release too, and how they wanted to build on their strengths in order to be successful when they got back home.
Thank you for mentioning that, Anne. Yeah, we do know from quite a bit of research at this point that almost every woman who's incarcerated or a defendant in the criminal legal system has experienced often profound and chronic trauma. And we know as well that violence and abuse are often learned behaviors, and they may also be self-protective behaviors, right? We've been talking about how folks try to protect themselves and keep themselves safe, both physically and emotionally. And when you've been harmed by someone else, it can often feel much safer to hurt them before they can hurt you. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation on trauma and implications for tribal justice systems. I'd like to thank my three panelists for joining me in this wonderful conversation, and thank you as well for joining us.